My name is Alara Vance, and I am 83 years young, though some days I feel like I've lived 100 lifetimes. I reside now in a quiet little cottage on the edge of Willow Creek, a town that's seen more sunrises than most folks have had hot meals. The porch swing creaks a familiar tune as I watch the world go by, but my mind often drifts back to a time when life wasn't so peaceful, when the air itself felt heavy with unspoken fear. People see a sweet old lady tending her rose garden, perhaps a bit forgetful, prone to a nap in the afternoon sun. They don't see the woman who once stood in a storm, a hurricane of fury and despair brewing inside her, forced to make choices no one should ever have to confront. They don't see the scars, not the ones on my skin, but the ones etched deep into my soul, visible only in the quiet moments when memories come unbidden. Willow Creek was a different place back then, smaller, more insular. Everyone knew everyone's business, or at least they thought they did. Our little farmhouse, nestled amongst fields of corn that stretched to the horizon, seemed idyllic to outsiders. A perfect picture of American rural life. But behind the gingham curtains and freshly painted porch, a different story unfolded. A story of control, of fear, and of a silence so profound it was deafening. My husband, Silas, was a man of the land, strong and unyielding like the oak tree in our front yard. He had a way of looking at you that could freeze your blood, a subtle shift in his jaw that spoke volumes before a single word was uttered. His presence was a constant, heavy blanket, suffocating the joy, the laughter, the very breath from our home. I remember my mother, a fragile bird with eyes that held a perpetual sadness. She moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps barely whispering on the wooden floors. Every flinch, every averted gaze, every quiet sigh told a tale of unspoken torment. I saw it, even as a young girl, but understanding it, truly grasping the depth of her suffering, came much later, with a crushing weight that still haunts my waking hours. The world outside our farm was bustling, vibrant, full of promises of a brighter future, but inside, time seemed to stand still, trapped in an endless loop of hushed whispers and unspoken threats. The fear was a living entity, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the slightest provocation to reveal its ugly face. My little sister, Bethany, was a sunbeam in that dark house. Her laughter, free and unrestrained, was a rare and precious sound, a brief respite from the ever-present gloom. She had a mop of fiery red hair and a spirit that, even in infancy, seemed determined to defy the shadows that clung to our home. Bethany was my world, my sole beacon of hope, a tiny hand that I clung to with all the ferocity of a protective lioness. I vowed then, with a fierce, childish certainty, that I would shield her, no matter the cost. My own youth was overshadowed by this protective instinct, sacrificing my own dreams and desires on the altar of her safety. Her innocence was a fragile flame, constantly threatened by the cold winds that blew through our lives. Then came the day, a day etched into my memory with a sharpness that time cannot dull, when the innocence of our home was irrevocably shattered. Bethany was just a toddler, full of the unbridled curiosity that only a child possesses. She had ventured into the barn, a place Silas often retreated to when his temper flared, a place that held a terrifying aura for us. I heard the sudden, sharp cry, a sound that pierced through the quiet afternoon like a knife. My heart leaped into my throat, a cold dread washing over me, a premonition of disaster that sent shivers down my spine. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, every sound fading into a distant hum as I raced towards the barn, my legs burning with an urgency I had never known. The scene that greeted me inside the dusty barn, illuminated by shafts of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls, is one that has haunted my nightmares for decades. It was a tableau of unspeakable horror, a moment frozen in time that would forever define the trajectory of our lives. The sight of Bethany, small and vulnerable, her bright red hair stark against the worn hay, and Silas, his face a mask of cold, unfeeling fury, ignited a fire within me, a primal rage that transcended all fear. In that instant, something shifted deep inside me. The fear that had held me captive for so long evaporated, replaced by a chilling clarity, a steely resolve that hardened my gaze and steeled my trembling hands. The walk back to the house from the barn was the longest journey of my young life. The 100 yards of trampled grass and familiar dirt felt like a barren, alien landscape. No one spoke. The only sounds were the frantic thumping of my own heart and the ragged, shallow breaths of my little sister, Bethany, whose tiny hand was fused to mine with a grip of pure terror. My father, Silas, walked ahead of us, his broad shoulders set, his stride as unhurried and confident as if he were simply returning from a day's work in the fields. He didn't look back, not once. It was this chilling composure, this utter lack of remorse or even acknowledgement of the horror that had just unfolded, that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. He was a monster who didn't even know he was a monster. The air, thick with the sweet smell of freshly cut hay from the barn, now seemed poisoned, carrying the metallic tang of fear and shattered innocence. As we reached the porch, Silas paused, turning the doorknob with a calm deliberation that sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. He held the door open, not as a gentleman, but as a jailer ushering his prisoners back into their cell. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met mine for a fleeting second. There was no anger in them, no shame, only a cold, possessive warning. It was a look that said, "This is my house. These are my rules. You saw nothing." The unspoken thread hung between us, thick and suffocating. I pulled Bethany closer, steering her past him and into the dim safety of the kitchen, my body a rigid shield between her and the man who was supposed to be her protector. The screen door slammed shut behind us, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound, crushing silence. It was the sound of a chapter ending, and a much darker one beginning. My mother was standing by the sink, her back to us, her hands submerged in a basin of soapy water. She didn't turn around when we entered, but I saw her shoulders tense, a barely perceptible ripple of fear that spoke volumes. She knew. In the same way an animal senses an earthquake long before the ground begins to shake, she knew something terrible had happened. But she remained frozen, a statue of denial, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. Bethany let go of my hand and ran to her, burying her face in the folds of her mother's worn dress, her small body racked with silent sobs. My mother's hand stilled in the water, but she did not turn. She did not kneel. She did not comfort her weeping child. She simply stood there, paralyzed by a fear so deep and so old that it had become a part of her very bones, leaving her incapable of the simplest act of maternal love. The days that followed were draped in a heavy, suffocating silence. Bethany's laughter was gone. She became a shadow of the girl she once was, moving through the rooms with a ghostly quietness, her bright eyes clouded with a perpetual fear. She flinched at every loud noise. She wouldn't leave my side, her small hand always seeking mine. Sleep offered her no escape, her nights were plagued by terrible dreams, her muffled cries waking me, and I would hold her until her trembling subsided, whispering promises of safety that I had no idea how to keep. My own life transformed overnight. I was no longer just a daughter or a sister, I became a sentinel, a strategist, a parent to both my sister and, in many ways, my mother. My every waking moment was consumed with a hypervigilance I had never known. One evening, after Bethany had finally cried herself to sleep, I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring into an empty cup. Her eyes, when they finally lifted to meet mine, were hollowed-out pools of defeat. They were the eyes of a prisoner who had long ago given up on the idea of escape. In them, I saw no fight, no anger, only a bottomless well of fear and resignation. And in that silent, heartbreaking exchange, I understood the crushing truth: she would not help us. She could not. He had broken her so completely that she no longer had the strength to even imagine a different life. It was down to me. Hope is a dangerous thing in a house like ours, but it is also stubborn. It arrived for me in the form of a rusted, old biscuit tin. For years, my mother had done mending work for some of the ladies in town. Silas allowed it because it made him look generous, and he took every cent she earned. Or so he thought. One afternoon, while looking for thread in her sewing basket, my fingers brushed against a false bottom. Beneath it was the tin. Inside, folded tightly, was a small wad of cash. A few dollars, saved over years from the scraps of her work. It was her own secret escape fund, a dream she was likely too terrified to ever act upon. A wave of guilt washed over me, but then I looked at Bethany, sitting listlessly on her bed, and I knew this wasn't theft. It was salvation. My mother's dream of escape may have died, but I would not let Bethany's future die with it. Holding that tin felt like holding a live coal. It was both a promise and a peril. The money was a start, but it wasn't enough, and the plan forming in my mind was a chaotic mess of a child's desperate imagination. I knew we needed to get to a bus station, but the nearest one was in Rockhaven, a town 10 miles away. How could a 13-year-old girl and her little sister walk 10 miles in the dead of night without being seen? What would we do when we got there? Where would we even go? The questions swarmed in my mind, a frantic buzzing of impossibilities. I realized I needed more than just money, I needed information. I needed a map of the world outside our farm, a world I knew almost nothing about. My new mission became a quiet, obsessive hunt for knowledge. I began studying my father, not just his moods, but his habits. I learned that he drove into town every second Friday to sell eggs and buy supplies. He always left a copy of the local newspaper, the Willow Creek Chronicle, on the kitchen table. Before, it was just a piece of trash to be cleared away. Now, it was a textbook. I would squirrel it away, and late at night, under my blanket with a stolen match lit for a few precious seconds at a time, I would study it. I learned the names of neighboring towns. I found advertisements for bus lines, with lists of destinations that sounded as exotic and unreachable as the moon: Silverton, Oakridge, Harmony. I traced the routes with my finger, trying to imagine a life in a place not tainted by his shadow. This new purpose made me bolder, but also more reckless. My observation of him became a dangerous dance. I had to get close to his things, to the places where information might be kept. His roll-top desk in the corner of the living room was a fortress I had never been allowed to touch. It was where he kept his ledgers, his bills, his connection to the outside world. I knew something I needed had to be in there. One Friday, when he was in town, I stood before it, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. My mother was in the garden, and Bethany was napping. It was my only chance. My hands trembled as I slowly, carefully, lifted the rolling cover. The smell of old paper, tobacco, and his sharp, distinct scent filled my nostrils, making me feel sick with fear. Inside was a mess of papers, but in a small cubbyhole, I saw it, a folded road map of the state. It was old and worn, but to me, it was a treasure beyond measure. I quickly unfolded it on the floor, my eyes scanning the web of lines and names. I found Willow Creek, just a tiny dot. And then, 10 miles east, a bigger dot, Rockhaven. I saw the highway, a thick red line, leading out of Rockhaven and heading north, passing through towns I'd read about in the paper. It was real. A path existed. I quickly folded the map and was about to slide it under my dress when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. He was back early. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I shoved the map back into the desk, fumbled to close the roll top, and spun around just as the kitchen door opened. He stood there, holding a sack of flour, his eyes sweeping the room and landing on me. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Just dusting, Father," I stammered, my mind screaming. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his gaze unblinking. I was sure he knew. I was sure he could smell my fear. Then, he grunted and walked past me, setting the flour on the counter. "See that you do it right," he said. I had survived, but the close call left me shaking for hours. The risk I was taking had become terrifyingly real. The map was a double-edged sword. It gave me a concrete path, a tangible route out of our prison, but it also highlighted the vast, terrifying emptiness of our plan. We could get to Rockhaven. We could get on a bus. But where would that bus take us? We had no one. No family to run to, no friends who would dare to help us. We would be two lost girls in a strange town with a handful of dollars and a monster hunting us from behind. The weight of this reality was crushing. I needed more than a destination on a map, I needed a sanctuary. I needed a name, a face, a door that might actually open for us. The answer, once again, came from a ghost of the past. My mind kept returning to my mother's cousin, Mildred, the kind, bustling woman who had visited that one Sunday and given me a $1 bill. I remembered the casual way she had talked about her life, her husband's job at a hardware store, her children. She lived in a town called Harmony. I found it on the map. It was north, nearly 60 miles away, a bus ride that would take hours. It was a long shot, a desperate, flimsy thread of hope, but it was the only one I had. She had seemed kind. She had shown me a moment of warmth. Perhaps that warmth could be stretched to shelter us. The problem was, I had no address, no way of finding her. This new obstacle felt insurmountable. How could I find one person in a town I had never even seen? My search for information grew more desperate. I started going through my mother's things when she was outside, a fresh wave of guilt washing over me with every drawer I opened. I felt like a thief in my own home, violating the privacy of the one person I was trying to save. In the bottom of her wardrobe, in a small wooden box filled with old photographs and faded baby ribbons, I found a small stack of letters tied with a piece of yarn. They were from Mildred, written years ago. My hands shook as I untied the yarn. The letters were filled with mundane news, but at the top of each one, written in neat, looping cursive, was what I was looking for, a return address. 142, Oak Street, Harmony. I memorized it, repeating the words over and over in my mind like a prayer. 142, Oak Street, Harmony. It was more than a location, it was a destination. It was a single point of light in an overwhelming darkness. Now, the plan had shape. We would take my mother's biscuit tin money. We would wait for a night when Silas was deep in a drunken sleep. We would walk the 10 miles to Rockhaven, following the main road under the cover of darkness. We would get to the bus station at dawn and buy 2 tickets to Harmony. And we would find 142, Oak Street. It was a terrifying, audacious plan, filled with 100 things that could go wrong, but for the first time, it felt possible. My focus shifted from gathering information to gathering supplies. Every act was a risk, every stolen item a potential trigger for his wrath. I started taking things that wouldn't be missed immediately. A handful of crackers from the pantry slipped into a cloth sack hidden under my mattress. 2 apples from the cellar. I managed to sneak one of my mother's old, threadbare shawls for Bethany. The most important and dangerous item was a book of matches from the kitchen mantelpiece. Without them, we would have no light if we were forced to hide off the road. Taking them felt like stealing fire from a dragon. I held my breath as my small fingers closed around the box, expecting his voice to boom from behind me at any second. But there was only silence. My collection of contraband grew slowly, a pathetic but precious hoard of survival tools. As the day I had secretly chosen drew closer, a Tuesday, 2 weeks away, the day after he received his monthly pay from the sawmill, when he was most likely to drink himself into a stupor, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. I felt as though I were made of glass, that at any moment Silas would look at me and see right through my skin to the frantic, secret plan churning within. He seemed to be watching me more closely than ever, his cold eyes following my every move. He was like a wolf, sensing a change in the herd, smelling the scent of fear and rebellion in the air. He didn't know what I was planning, but he knew something was different. And his knowledge made him more volatile, more dangerous. The final days were a tightrope walk over a canyon, and I prayed with every fiber of my being that we would make it to the other side. The day of the escape arrived with a heavy, ominous sky. The air was thick and still, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. It felt like the world was holding its breath along with me. I went through the day's chores in a daze, my movements mechanical, my mind a whirlwind of fear and last-minute calculations. Every interaction with my father was torture. When he spoke to me, I had to force myself to meet his gaze, to keep my voice even, terrified that he would see the truth in my eyes. I felt like a traitor, a spy, a girl playing a part that was too big for her. The sack with our meager supplies, crackers, 2 apples, the shawl, and the matches, was tucked deep under my mattress, a secret lump that I was sure was visible to the entire world. As evening fell, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain began to lash against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the farmhouse. It was a perfect cover. The noise would hide our footsteps, the darkness would be our cloak. Silas came home from the sawmill, soaked and irritable. As I had hoped, he had his monthly pay. He sat at the kitchen table, not with a beer, but with a bottle of whiskey. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. This was our chance. He drank steadily, his mood growing fouler with each glass. He yelled at my mother for the soup being too salty. He kicked the leg of the table when the dog whined at the back door. I kept my head down, making myself small, invisible, and hustled Bethany off to our room as early as I could. I put Bethany to bed, but I knew she wouldn't sleep. Her eyes were wide in the dim light, and she could feel the tension radiating from me. "What's wrong, Alara?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I knelt beside her bed, taking her small, cold hands in mine. "We're going on a trip," I whispered back, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "A secret adventure, just you and me. But we have to be very, very quiet. Can you do that for me? Can you be my brave, silent partner?" She looked at me, her lower lip trembling, but she nodded. The trust in her eyes was a physical weight, a sacred responsibility that both terrified and strengthened me. I told her to rest, but not to sleep. We would leave when the house was finally quiet. We waited for what felt like an eternity. We could hear Silas still moving about, his heavy footsteps thudding on the floorboards, his slurred voice cursing at the storm. Then we heard a loud crash from the living room, followed by a profound silence. I waited, counting the seconds, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing. Just the drumming of the rain and the whistling of the wind. After 20 minutes of agonizing silence, I knew I had to check. I crept to our bedroom door, opening it a crack. The hallway was dark, but a faint light came from the living room. On my hands and knees, I crawled to the doorway and peered around the edge. He was passed out in his armchair, the empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside him, his head thrown back, a loud, ragged snore escaping his lips. He was gone. The path was clear. I crawled back to the room, my heart soaring with a terrifying mix of relief and adrenaline. "It's time," I breathed. I helped Bethany into her coat and pulled the old shawl around her shoulders. I retrieved our supply sack and the biscuit tin of money from under my bed, tucking the tin deep into my coat pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie my own shoes. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the house, sounded like him waking up. We crept out of our room and down the hall, past the living room where the monster slept, past my parents' bedroom door, behind which my mother lay in her own silent prison. A part of me wanted to knock on her door, to tell her to come with us, but I knew it was useless. She was too broken. We had to save ourselves. The kitchen door was our final obstacle. It had a bolt that always made a loud, scraping sound. I held my breath, wrapped my trembling hand around the cold metal, and slid it back as slowly, as gently as I possibly could. The sound was a screech in the silent house, as loud as a gunshot to my terrified ears. I froze, listening, waiting for the snoring from the living room to stop. It continued its ragged rhythm. We were clear. I pushed the door open, and a gust of cold, wet wind hit our faces. We slipped out into the stormy night, pulling the door gently shut behind us. We were out. We were free. But as we stood there in the pouring rain, with the 10 dark miles to Rockhaven stretching out before us, I knew our journey had only just begun. The night swallowed us whole. The moment we were clear of the small circle of light from our porch, we were plunged into an almost total blackness, broken only by the occasional flash of distant lightning. The rain was relentless, soaking us to the bone within minutes, plastering our hair to our faces and turning the dirt road into a slick, treacherous river of mud. Every step was a struggle. I held Bethany's hand in a death grip, half pulling her along as she stumbled through the dark. The wind howled in our ears, carrying with it the sounds of the storm, which thankfully drowned out the frantic pounding of my own heart. I kept looking back over my shoulder at the farmhouse, a single, lonely light in the vast darkness, expecting at any moment to see the porch light flash on, to hear his enraged roar cutting through the storm. The 10 miles to Rockhaven had seemed like a simple, straight line on the map. On foot, in the dead of night, in a storm, it was an impossible distance. The road was empty, which was both a blessing and a curse. We were alone, but we were also exposed. Every flicker of lightning illuminated us, two small, desperate figures on a desolate country road. After what felt like hours, Bethany began to cry, her sobs lost in the wind. "I can't, Alara," she wept, her small body trembling with cold and exhaustion. "I can't walk anymore." My own legs felt like lead, my lungs burned with every cold, wet breath I took, but I knew we couldn't stop. Stopping meant defeat. Stopping meant he could find us. I pulled her off the road, under the relative shelter of a large oak tree. I took out the sack and gave her one of the apples. It was a small comfort, but it was all I had. "We're almost there," I lied, my voice chattering from the cold. "Just a little further. Remember our secret adventure? Brave partners have to be strong." I tried to light a match to see the map, but my hands were shaking too badly and the wind was too strong. The match sputtered and died. We were lost, not in direction, but in a sea of darkness and despair. For a moment, a wave of hopelessness washed over me. What had I done? I had dragged my little sister out into a storm, with no real plan, running from a monster only to face the cold indifference of the world. Just as I was about to give in to the tears that were burning behind my eyes, I saw them. Headlights. A car was coming down the road, its beams cutting through the rain. My first instinct was to panic, to pull Bethany deeper into the shadows. What if it was him? What if he had woken up and was hunting for us? We pressed ourselves against the rough bark of the tree, trying to disappear. But as the car drew closer, I saw it was an old, beat-up pickup truck, not my father's. It slowed as it approached, and then, to my horror, it stopped right beside us. The passenger's side window rolled down, and an old man with a weathered face and a kind, worried expression peered out. "You girls all right?" he called out over the storm. "What in God's name are you doing out in this weather?" I was frozen with indecision. Every warning I had ever received about strangers screamed in my head. But then I looked at Bethany, shivering and miserable, and I knew we couldn't go on like this. I had to take a chance. Our car broke down," I stammered, the lie feeling clumsy and thin. "We're trying to get to Rockhaven. Our aunt lives there." The old man looked at us for a long moment, his eyes taking in our soaked clothes and terrified faces. He knew I was lying, but he didn't call me on it. He just sighed. "Well, you'll catch your death out here. Get in. I'll take you to town." It was a terrifying offer, but it was also a miracle. I helped Bethany into the warm, dry cab of the truck and climbed in after her. The old farmer's name was Mr. Abernathy, and he didn't ask any more questions. He just turned the heat up and drove us the rest of the way to Rockhaven, the steady rhythm of his windshield wipers a comforting beat in the stormy night. He dropped us at the edge of town, near a diner that was still lit up. "Your aunt's house near here?" he asked gently. I nodded. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "God bless you, child," he said, and then he drove off into the rain, a kind stranger who had appeared out of the storm and saved us from the road to nowhere. The diner was a beacon of warmth and light in the pre-dawn gloom. The smell of coffee and frying bacon wafted through the door, a scent from a normal world we no longer belonged to. We huddled under the diner's awning, shivering, waiting for the sun to rise and the bus station to open. The handful of dollars in the biscuit tin felt woefully inadequate. I counted it again and again, as if the sheer act of looking at it might make it multiply. Mr. Abernathy's kindness had saved us from the storm, but now a new set of fears crowded in. Would we have enough money for the tickets? Would someone question two young girls traveling alone? Would my father's reach somehow extend all the way here? When the sky began to lighten from black to a bruised purple, we made our way to the bus station, a small, drab building a few blocks away. I approached the ticket counter with a confidence I did not feel, holding Bethany's hand tightly. I tried to make my voice sound older, more certain. 2 tickets to Harmony, please, I said to the tired-looking man behind the counter. He barely glanced at us, his eyes half-closed with boredom. He told me the price, and my heart sank. It would take almost every penny we had. I pushed the crumpled bills across the counter, my hand trembling slightly. He handed me the 2 thin paper tickets. They felt like the most precious objects in the world. Our bus wasn't for another hour. We sat on a hard wooden bench, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible, my eyes darting towards the door every time it opened. The bus ride was a blur. Bethany, exhausted from the ordeal, fell asleep almost immediately, her head resting on my lap. I stayed awake, my face pressed against the cold glass of the window, watching the landscape change. I watched the familiar cornfields of our home give way to rolling hills and towns I had only ever seen on a map. With every mile that passed, a small bit of the tension in my shoulders eased. We were putting distance between us and him. We were moving towards our single point of light, 142, Oak Street, Harmony. But the relief was tinged with a deep, aching sadness. I thought of my mother, left behind in that house of horrors. Had I been right to leave her? The guilt was a heavy stone in my stomach. When we finally arrived in Harmony, it was late afternoon. The town was larger than Willow Creek, with a bustling main street and rows of neat houses with manicured lawns. It was terrifying and overwhelming. After asking a kind-looking woman for directions, we began the long walk to Oak Street. My hope, which had been so bright and determined, began to waver. What if Mildred turned us away? What if she called our father? Why would she risk her own peaceful life for 2 bedraggled relatives who had appeared on her doorstep out of nowhere? By the time we found the house, a small, tidy home with a porch swing and pots of bright red geraniums, my courage had almost completely deserted me. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, just staring at the house, my feet rooted to the spot. It was Bethany who finally spurred me into action. "Are we going in?" she asked, her voice small. I took a deep breath, walked up the path, and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was Mildred. She looked older than I remembered, her hair grayer, but her eyes were just as kind. They were also filled with a profound shock as she recognized us. "Elara? Bethany? My goodness, child, what on earth?" Her voice trailed off as she took in our appearance, our damp, wrinkled clothes, our pale, exhausted faces. I didn't have a speech prepared. The words just tumbled out, a desperate, jumbled story of fear and escape. I didn't tell her everything, not the worst parts, but I told her enough. I told her about our father's rage, about my mother's fear, and about our terrifying flight in the night. I watched her face as I spoke, saw the kindness in her eyes battle with a dawning fear. I could see the conflict, the calculation. Helping us meant inviting trouble into her home, inviting the shadow of my father into her life. Her husband, a stern-looking man I could now see standing behind her, had a frown on his face. This was the moment. Her decision would determine our fate. After a long, agonizing silence, Mildred seemed to come to a decision. She let out a long breath, and the fear in her eyes was replaced by a look of resolute compassion. "Well," she said, her voice firm. "You can't stand out here. Come in, both of you. You'll have a hot meal and a warm bed for the night." She opened the door wider, and as we stepped across the threshold, into the safety of her home, a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy washed over me. We had found it. A sanctuary, however fragile, however temporary, was ours. Life at Mildred's house was like living in a different world. It was quiet. It was calm. There was no shouting, no heavy, threatening footsteps, no suffocating blanket of fear. Mildred's husband, Frank, remained wary of us, his conversations short and his glances suspicious, but Mildred was a wellspring of kindness. She gave us clean clothes, fed us until our stomachs were full for the first time in memory, and fussed over us with a maternal warmth that was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what our own mother could not give. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of the old Bethany return. After a few days, she began to speak in more than just whispers. She even laughed once, a small, tentative sound, at one of Mildred's stories. It was a sound I had feared I would never hear again. We fell into a fragile routine. I helped Mildred with chores around the house, trying to make us as little of a burden as possible. I read stories to Bethany from Mildred's children's old books. In these moments, I could almost pretend that this was our life, that we were safe, that the past was just a bad dream. But the dream was never far away. At night, I would lie awake in the small guest bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a new house, and the fear would creep back in. My father was still out there. He was not a man who let go of what he considered his property. I knew he would be looking for us. The sanctuary Mildred had given us felt like a house of glass, beautiful and safe for now, but easily shattered. Our fragile peace was broken about a week after we arrived. The telephone rang in the hallway, and Mildred answered it. I was in the kitchen, but I could hear the change in her voice. Her cheerful greeting became clipped and tense. Her replies were short, monosyllabic. Yes. I see. No. No, I haven't. My blood ran cold. I knew, with a sickening certainty, who was on the other end of that line, or at least who the call was about. When Mildred hung up, she came into the kitchen, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. That was your Aunt Clara, from back home, she said, her voice strained. She said Silas has been telling everyone in town that his daughters have been kidnapped. The sheriff has been asking questions. The words hit me like a physical blow. He was twisting the story, painting himself as the grieving father, the victim. He was using the law, the very people who were supposed to protect us, as his own personal hunting party. The shadow of our past was no longer just a memory, it was actively reaching for us, its fingers stretching across the miles. The fear I had been holding at bay came roaring back, more powerful than ever. He would find us. It was only a matter of time. Frank came home from work that evening to find a tense, silent house. Mildred told him about the phone call, and I saw the "I told you so" look in his eyes. Later that night, I heard them arguing in their bedroom, their voices low but sharp. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew what they were saying. We were a danger to them. We had brought the monster to their door. The next day, the warmth in the house was gone, replaced by a strained politeness. Frank barely looked at us. Even Mildred seemed distant, her kindness now tinged with a nervous anxiety. I knew we couldn't stay. We had worn out our welcome, not through any fault of our own, but because the shadow we carried was too dark, too long. We were poison, and we were tainting their peaceful lives. That afternoon, I packed our few belongings back into the small cloth sack. When Mildred found me, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, child," she whispered. "I don't want you to go, but Frank, he's scared." "I know," I said, my own voice thick. "You've done more than enough. You gave us a place to rest." But as I looked at Bethany, who had overheard and whose face was once again a pale mask of fear, I had no idea where we would go next. We were back where we started, alone, with nowhere to run, and the hunter was getting closer. We left Mildred's house the next morning. She pressed a small handful of bills into my hand, tears streaming down her face, and made me promise I would try to call her. As we walked away from the little house on Oak Street, the only sanctuary we had ever known, a profound and desolate loneliness settled over me. We were adrift again. We spent the next 2 days in a state of limbo, wandering the streets of Harmony during the day, trying to look like we belonged, and sleeping at night in the cold, cavernous waiting room of the bus station. The money Mildred had given us was quickly dwindling on crackers and milk for Bethany. The hope that had carried me this far was crumbling into dust. On the third day, as I was trying to decide what our next move could possibly be, I knew I had to keep my promise. I found a payphone and, with trembling fingers, I dialed Mildred's number. I was terrified Frank would answer, but it was Mildred's soft voice that came on the line. "Elara?" "Oh, thank God," she cried, a wave of relief in her voice. "Child, you must listen to me. Something has happened. Something unbelievable." She told me that she had received another call, not from a worried relative, but from the Willow Creek sheriff himself. He was looking for us, not to return us to our father, but to tell us we were safe. I couldn't comprehend her words. "What do you mean, safe?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. And then Mildred told me a story that seemed impossible, a story of a courage I never knew existed. After we had fled, my father's rage, with no one else to focus on, had turned completely on my mother. For days, he had kept her locked in the house, a prisoner, tormenting her with threats of what he would do when he found us. But something in my mother, something that had been dormant for decades, finally broke. Or perhaps, it didn't break, perhaps it was finally forged into something strong. One night, after a particularly brutal beating, as he lay in another drunken stupor, she did not cower. She did not cry. She did what we had never dared to do. She walked out of the house, down the long dirt road, and straight to the town sheriff's office. She walked into that office, a small, battered woman who had been invisible her whole life, and she refused to be silent any longer. She showed the sheriff her bruises. She told him everything. Not just about his fists, but about the barn. About Bethany. About the years of terror that had suffocated the life out of her family. She spoke of the monster who lived behind the facade of the hardworking farmer, and she did not stop until she had laid every single ugly truth bare. In a time and place where such things were never spoken of, where a man's home was his castle, my mother's act was nothing short of a revolution. The sheriff, a man who had likely known for years what kind of man Silas was finally faced with a truth he could no longer ignore. He had to act. They had gone to the farm and arrested Silas that very morning. He was in a cell. The monster was finally in a cage. I stood at the payphone, the receiver pressed hard against my ear, tears streaming down my face. I was crying not from fear or sadness, but from a swell of awe and pride so immense it felt like my heart would burst. My mother, the fragile, broken bird, had found the strength to fly. She hadn't done it for herself, she had done it for us. Our escape, our desperate act of survival, had somehow lit a fire in her, burning away the years of fear and leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding maternal love. She had stayed behind not as a victim, but as a rear guard, fighting the final battle so that her children could truly be free. The journey back to Willow Creek was the opposite of the one we had taken to escape it. This time, we were not running from something, but towards it. Mildred drove us herself, insisting it was the least she could do. As we drove, I watched the familiar landscape unfold not with terror, but with a sense of strange, detached reclamation. These were the same roads, the same fields, but the world itself felt different, lighter. The oppressive shadow that had colored my entire existence was gone. When we arrived, we didn't go to the farm. We went straight to the sheriff's office. And there, waiting for us on the steps, was my mother. She was thin and frail, her face etched with the marks of her final battle with Silas, but her eyes were different. The haunted, defeated look was gone. In its place was a clear, steady light I had never seen before. When she saw us, her face crumpled, and she ran to us, gathering both me and Bethany into her arms. We clung to each other, a broken but now healing family, weeping together not in sorrow, but in overwhelming relief. "It's over," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "He can't ever hurt you again." In that moment, she was no longer the fragile bird I had left behind. She was a phoenix, risen from the ashes of her own life, strong and beautiful and free. Our old life was gone. The farmhouse was sold, its contents auctioned off. We never set foot in it again. We couldn't. The memories it held were too dark, too painful. With the little money from the sale and the help of the church and a few townspeople who, now that the truth was out, were suddenly eager to show their sympathy, we found a small rental house on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was ours. It was a home built not on fear, but on a foundation of hard-won freedom. Silas was convicted. In those days, justice was a different thing, and he didn't spend the rest of his life in prison, but he spent enough years there that by the time he got out, he was an old, broken man who left the state and was never heard from again. The years that followed were not always easy. Scars, especially the ones you can't see, take a long time to heal. Bethany remained quiet for many years, the shadow of her trauma a constant companion. But slowly, with the unwavering, fierce love of a mother who was finally free to give it, the light began to return to her eyes. She eventually found her laughter again. My mother, too, found a new life. She got a job at the town library, where she was surrounded by the quiet and the stories she had always loved. She never remarried. She had had enough of men for one lifetime. She dedicated her life to her girls, and to finding the peace she had been denied for so long. And me? I grew up. I finished school, got married to a good, kind man, and had children of my own. I built a life filled with the laughter and warmth that had been stolen from my own childhood. And now, I am an old woman, sitting on my porch, watching my grandchildren play in the yard, their shouts of joy a beautiful, healing music. People see a sweet old lady tending her roses. They don't see the 13-year-old girl who once walked 10 miles in a storm, with her sister's hand in hers and a desperate plan in her heart. They don't see the silent vow made in a dusty barn, a vow that changed the course of 3 lives forever. But I remember. I remember so that I can appreciate the peace of this porch swing, the warmth of the sun on my face, and the incredible, resilient strength of the human heart to not only survive the storm, but to find a way, against all odds, to finally reach the sunrise. Thank you for walking with me on this journey through my past. My story is a testament to the fact that even after the longest, darkest night, the sun will rise. If this story has touched you, please share it. You never know who might need to hear that hope is real, and courage is a choice we can all make. Subscribe for more stories of survival and the strength of the human spirit.